Well, welcome to class today. We are going to talk in this class, the first part, about intimate partner violence and the church's response to it. And we're going to talk about Pamela Cooper White's book, especially chapter 5 in Pamela Cooper White's work. And I might interweave some stories from my own ministry and from, there's a chapter in my intro to pastoral care text that talks about intimate partner violence and some of the challenges of helping people leave situations of intimate partner violence, especially in long-term church ministry, where the boundaries between families can be a little bit tricky to work with. So on average, it takes 11 and a half years for someone to leave an intimate partner violence situation. And so a clergy person might be helpful in staging an intervention and protecting a person's privacy and help them find shelter, but then they might be returning to a situation of violence again. And so often it's a pattern of working with intimate partner violence is a spiritual journey as well as a relational journey. And helping people discover the agency that they have to make their own decisions is a pastoral care process that's at the heart of family care. And so in this talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of Cooper White's key ideas and then bring them into conversation with some of my own work and some of my own scenarios. When I was in... I'm sorry that we aren't able to have this conversation in person because I feel like this is a really important topic in the care for families. In fact, it's so prevalent and the church is so often a haven for batterers that if we don't understand this important aspect of seeking safety in family life, we're going to miss out on a significant part of what it means to provide pastoral care for families. So the violence in families, for me, challenges any easy idealization of a family as an institution that's separate from patterns of violence or control, as an institution that's somehow sacred or special in and of itself. Instead, I would say it's sacred insofar as it protects the dignity and well-being of each of its members, especially the most vulnerable. And some relationships tend to develop patterns of vulnerability that are distinctively harmful for their members. In a Lenten Ash Wednesday service, Pastor Janelle reads from a psalm, "God is our refuge and strength, the very present help in times of trouble." After reading the scripture, she prays aloud that those facing violence in their relationship may find safety, relief from harm, and relational justice. Afterwards, Pam reaches out for an appointment, realizing that her pastor might be a safe person to talk to about her problems. First, Pastor Janelle assures her that she will not break her confidentiality and gives Pam some specific advice on ways that she can cover her tracks so that her husband will not know about their meeting. Pam begins by describing how the abusive patterns in her relationship had developed. Early in their relationship, Sandy, her husband, had tried to control Pam's clothing and manage her contacts with friends and family. Pam had a few friends who warned her about Sandy's controlling nature, but she loved him too much to listen to their advice. On the night of their anniversary, he hit her and accused her of being unfaithful. He was contrite for weeks afterwards, because she thought it might have been an anomaly. Pam wanted to believe that he would never hit her again. Later, the punches, slaps, and even lockouts from their home became more common. But when Pam threatened to leave him, Sandy became suicidal and threatened suicide and demanded that she stay with him. Their son Kevin was born during the 5th year of their marriage. Pam hoped the abuse would stop, but it only escalated. So this is a little vignette from my book, the Intro to Pastoral Care book, chapter 5, where I talk about stories of abuse survivors. And I talk about the long-term care that's given by Pastor Janelle to Pam in her family as she's facing abuse. And you might just as easily be in the position of And so in this case, you could hear the patterns that Pamela Cooper White talks about. The cycling of violence, how someone, there's a period of contrition quite often, and someone feels like things might be getting better during the period when the flowers come and there's walking on eggshells and that kind of thing. Cooper White warns us not to be tricked by a batterer's side of the story at that point. They're often wanting forgiveness, and humiliated might be one word for it, but seeking a respite through loving and contrite behavior. And that's often when ministers might get involved in caring for persons who are facing intimate partner violence. In my book, I talk about how Pam has kind of grown up with a Christian socialization as a woman, as an obedient wife from the devotional books that she read. And she also has this ideal wedding or ideal marriage in her head that she thinks she should be able to solve the problems in her marriage. This might be one version of Culbertson's rescue marriage, although it's distinctively shaped by the patterns of violence. So I don't know if rescue marriage alone could quantify the kind of harm that goes on. And so when Pastor Janelle's doing pastoral work with Pam in the process of leaving, she's also doing theological work, helping her interpret passages like the Ephesians passage about obedience to husbands and other passages that Pam's internalized as a part of her abuse. And so what she has to work with is this sense and perception that somehow she's to blame for her suffering. And over time, people who are in abusive relationships also begin to doubt their own perceptions. And so it can help to have someone trustworthy come alongside of them and confirm that what they're going through is a crime, that they're not responsible for it, and that they don't deserve it. Then Pastor Janelle has to do some safety planning, and she realizes that part of her role as a pastor is being a representative of hope for Pam, who seems like she's at the end of her resources. And so she helps build some social supports for her, asking about the support of friends or families if she's ever tried to leave. But she's really in a position of giving her options at this point. So safety planning with battered women, according to Jill Davies in 1998, is really about allowing people agency in the complicated decisions in their lives and helping them feel like they have a choice to make. So Pastor Janelle does assess the safety of their son and Kevin and wants to be sure that he's safe. She also has a pastoral obligation to report if she believes like abuse is happening to him. There's also the domestic violence hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE or 799-7233. And so she knows some local shelters have availability for women and children. Pastor Janelle even has a leaving kit in her office made up with some basic toiletries and charged cell phone that she offers to Pam. Pam's not sure at this point whether she wants to leave, but the pastor still takes this approach of empowerment where she's encouraging of Pam's talking to her, and she's helping her interpret Scripture and God's presence in her life. Pam also is helped tremendously by the female images of God that Pastor Janelle uses, and those become a source of transformation for her. In the pastoral care that I describe in this book, Pam leaves twice and comes back to Sandy each time, which is a kind of a source of disappointment for Pastor Janelle, but she works with that without becoming discouraged. What I want to say and what I want to emphasize is that when people who go through domestic violence, pastoral care needs to consist of helping those who have been abused to tell the story of their lives. And so that's a sign of dignity and spiritual transformation. What are some of the themes that emerge from the lives of people who've gone through abuse in their intimate partner relationships and then seek to leave? Some themes that have become important in research are acknowledging the abuse that's been perceived and challenging perceptions of being a submissive spouse, being receptive to advocating voices that could help give a reality check when the person starts to fall into self-blame, accepting the support of others, including listening for the voice of God, adjusting to new ways of living, which include coping with financial difficulties, acknowledging anger and loss, fear towards God, and a set of emotions that only arise once the abuser is gone. So this is a spiritual journey, the journey of leaving abusive relationships, one that deepens self-awareness and self-esteem. It involves acknowledging, looking within oneself, and realizing that one is a person of worth, and reconnecting with supportive relationships. It also means reaffirming faith-based practices and beliefs, including discovering a closeness to God. So early on in recovery from intimate partner violence, people often have a linking together of their image of God and the image of the abuser. But as they make multiple attempts to leave and become more empowered in their life, they discover a new perspective of God that becomes separate from the abuser. So this is all a part of reconnecting with faith practices and reconnecting with strengthening and supportive relationships. So this is a long-term pastoral ministry, and it becomes really challenging in a context where you might have both abusers and abused in your work. The average minister will see about 14 cases of domestic violence annually and should be attuned to a survivor's experience. But often this is one area where ministers do pretty poorly compared to social workers and other professionals, including ministers sometimes ask abused people to go back to relationships or to forgive the abuser. So we'll talk about why that is so harmful. Well, 1/4 to 1/2 of all women in the U.S. experience severe physical abuse in their relationship at some point in their life. And battering does also happen to men, and it happens in intimate partner violence in lesbian and gay relationships as well, where they can have a challenge to access shelter services. Battering is trying to includes relationships where someone intimidates or controls a battered person in order to establish and maintain authority. So the battering occurs is part of a power relationship. And we've talked in this class about how inequalities in power in marriages are often one of the things that contributes to the denigration of the marriage over time. So battering is one extreme form, one which is a crime, but it belongs in a long-standing pattern of men's power over women in their intimate relationships. And this can include physical violence, which goes on a spectrum from abuse to death, but it also sometimes includes emotional manipulation, such as gaslighting and trying to convince someone that their perceptions are not true. Threats, intimidation, and denigration of a partner that tries to put them in their place because of insecurity on the part of the male perpetrator. And batters tend to suffer from low self-esteem and want to control partners and tend to have very traditional ideas about sex roles. And then they tend to have big splits in their personality as well. So good and bad are really clearly defined, and they project onto others the bad parts and can't accept any bad parts in themselves. Men who batter have a really difficult time accepting responsibility for their behavior. I really like the myths Cooper White talks about battering. She says that there's a myth that battering only happens to poor women or women of color. Instead, it happens to professionals in supposedly crime-free neighborhoods and in our religious communities as well. I was teaching a Sunday school class, my first adult education class in seminary when I was an intern. And after my class, the woman came up from the class and said, "Did you notice what happened in there?" And this was in a wealthy suburban community in the Northeast. And she said, "Did you notice what happened in there?" And I said, I didn't really. it turns out that she had disagreed with her husband in the class, and because of that, she felt like she was going to be at a higher risk for violence in her relationship. And so that was one of many times, almost everywhere I've been, I've had someone disclose to me that they were in a violent relationship. And that was one of the first times that that's happened. And I worked with my supervisor in SPM, and who knew about this domestic violence situation and touched base with the abused partner in a confidential way and made sure that she was safe and continued to offer her resources for making decisions. So domestic violence might seem like something that only happens to other people, but it happens in our religious communities as well. The myth that violence is rare and only done by sociopathic men. Over 1.5 million women are physically assaulted and or raped by an intimate partner in the U.S. each year. And that's one quarter to one half of all women in the United States will experience physical abuse in their relationship at one point in their lifetime. The myth, number 3, that women are to blame for their battering, and this can contribute, the psychotherapeutic community can contribute to this by talking about learned helplessness and masochism, codependency, but no one asks or causes or deserves to be assaulted or abused. To believe that a woman deserved it or provoked a man to anger is to confuse violence with anger, Cooper White says. The myth that battered women are masochistic. Sadism and masochism are part of some people's sex life, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that's not consensual, in that it develops over a period of years and slowly takes a person's agency away. Number 5, the myth that battered women are to blame because they simply cannot leave. The reality is that under the tyranny of battering, an internalization of bad feelings that goes along with it have a more profound effect than most people realize. Most women want to be strong and believe they should be able to fix their relationship, sometimes through their own willpower. That's that rescue myth that we were talking about. Cooper White shows that we shouldn't just focus on the psychology of women, but we should focus on a culture that includes widespread battering. And finally, the myth that domestic violence is an intimate, a private matter. But laws against battering, stalking, and marital rape are increasingly being passed through state legislatures and need to be enforced. So Pamela Cooper White gives a framework for unmasking some of the myths that surround intimate partner violence. When I was a youth pastor, I taught a lesson about Jesus turning over the tables in the temple, and I asked the question to the youth, were people afraid of Jesus in this instance? And the youth said, one of the youth who had been in a long-term chronic battering situation in his home where his father repeatedly beat his mother, and we tried to give resources for her to leave, but she wasn't able to leave over and over again. Or she left and then came back. This young man, who had seen so much violence in his own home and who needed Jesus to be a different figure than his own father, said that it was impossible that that people were afraid of Jesus in the New Testament, and so he affirmed that the love of Jesus was such a force of gentleness and power that it could heal and counteract violence and couldn't participate in human violence. And so he provided, because I knew the story, I knew how poignant his response was. But that's just another example of how in everyday ministry, you'll experience people who've gone through intimate partner violence in their families, and it's going to impact their interpretation of Scripture and other themes. So we've just debunked some of the myths surrounding intimate partner violence with Cooper White's help. But we want to say, again, there's no one profile of this problem. So it always occurs in the context and the cultural identity of the batter is significant. And it's one of the hardest things to recover from because it involves what Diana Jack calls a silencing of the self, a progressive form of silencing of the self. She wrote this amazing book, Silencing the Self, a feminist psychotherapy approach. But battering happens across social class and identities and ethnic identities. It always occurs in a context. And recent immigrants from Mexico, India, Southeast Asia might have a hard time as they try to leave relationships that have been violent, because the courts in the United States, according to Shamita Dasgupta, the courts in the United States seem to, with immigrant women, seem to blame violence on the culture. And so they say that it's culturally bound or culturally specific behavior. And so there's even less resources for immigrant women as they try to leave domestic violence situations. LGBTQ people in the United States are as diverse as the culture, and battering happens in these relationships as well. But as I mentioned before, they often lack access to good shelter services. Every year I read and assign the NCAVP report on intimate partner violence in gay and lesbian relationships. And blacks in the gay and lesbian community are more likely to face homicides in their partnerships, and transgender people are most likely to face the most severe forms of abuse. According to most recent survey data, the poverty worsens the effects of intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community. So economic factors such as widespread employment can be one factor in worsening this problem in the United States. So as I've suggested, women defined advocacy as a distinctive approach to domestic violence. It's taken widespread. So if you work on the domestic violence hotline, which you can in your seminary experience, you'll be taught to help people make decisions in their relationship. Similar to what Christy Kazad-Nuger calls helping women make choices. So safety planning in these relationships will be a long process, perhaps, of helping women make decisions about leaving relationships and helping them decide their next steps rather than telling them what to do. So you analyze the risks that women and their children face, and some women will decide that intimate partner violence is not their greatest risk, and others will decide it is and be equipped to leave. So we need to be oriented away from the rescue model towards one that's more about long-term empowerment. So here's some practical advice. First of all, let's just say that violence in a relationship is always grounds for divorce, but too many clergy disbelieve this or think that counseling couples where violence has occurred is helpful. This is not true. Counseling couples where violence is occurring is very dangerous, and it shouldn't be practiced by pastors. The proper ministerial response means believing the battered partner, reminding that person that it's not their fault, and providing resources for them. You want to be aware of signs of people who seem accident-prone, falling down the stairs, walking into doors, being injured, getting out of a car. Strokes in young women can be signs of abuse. And anxiety or anxiety-related health problems can also be signs of abuse. Hypervigilance, a startle response. You want to ask the person when it's safe and the batterer is not there, is someone hurting you? And always appreciate the answer to this question. Even if they aren't experiencing abuse, they appreciate being asked this question. Again, never counsel together, but always refer for the battered partner. And don't collude with the battered partner with explanations like, I have a short fuse, or they're just egging me on, or it's the drugs and alcohol. So to some do's and don'ts, don't tell the battered partner what to do. They've experienced that enough in their intimate partner relationship. Don't tell a battered spouse to pray more or that she can save the relationship. Don't pretend that battering does not happen here by never mentioning it in your religious communities. Instead, I would have a week every year you devote to it, and then additional education done by a social worker in your congregation who could talk about the prevalence of violence and risk signs, and then some steps that are helpful for leaving. Don't shame the battering survivor. So don't use derogatory terms or have a deep appreciation for how difficult this journey is. Don't counsel the battered and the battered together. We talked about that. Don't shame a battered person for not leaving. Don't accept the batterer's excuses for having a short temper and an alcohol problem. Don't testify on the batterer's behalf or write statements to the court on behalf of the batterer. And don't expose the private address of a domestic violence shelter to a batterer. That one is a little bit tricky. Nowadays, it's hard to keep privacy for these shelters, but we can talk about that too. Here's some positive things you can do. Do confirm that you believe the reports of abuse, stating that it's not the person's fault for being abused. Do state that abuse is a crime. Do assess the safety of children and report to CPS if you believe that there's abuse of a child. If your local system for CPS is underfunded, work to raise public awareness of the problem and advocate for better wages and support for staff. Do include cards in your bathrooms in your religious community, both in the men's bathroom and the women's bathroom, asking, are you being abused in your relationship? In the National Domestic Violence Hotline, again, 1-800-799-SAFE, 7233. Do attend a seminar on domestic violence. Do have leaving packets ready with basic toiletries and a charged cell phone when women want to leave. And do tell stories about battered partners at the pulpit and in Christian religious education contexts. Ask those who are battered about what their options are and help them explore a range of choices. Support your local domestic violence shelter and hotline, maybe even volunteering yourself. And then talk about battering, something that happens in the church, and offer concrete steps for safety for those in battering relationships. So these kinds of relationships, once you have a sense of how prevalent they are, might challenge your own physical and psychological resources. So I encourage you to think carefully about this and have some resources on hand, including this domestic violence phone number in your cell phone or something like that. When I was a hospice chaplain and I was just visiting someone in the nursing home, a nurse came up to me and said, I'm in danger in my relationship and wanted help leaving, but I didn't feel like I had adequate resources at that time to help her. I didn't even have the domestic violence hotline phone number on me. So I feel like we're in a different era now, but I want you to be prepared and be a kind person who's open to people so that they can feel like they can trust you with this kind of disclosure. And once they do, that you could be a person who provides support for them. So let me just touch briefly on the issue of reconciliation and forgiveness, which we've touched on in other parts of the class. In the process of counseling abused spouses, some ministers raise the issue of forgiveness. And this is kind of an inappropriate thing to do. So raising the issue of forgiveness because there's an imbalance of power on behalf of the pastor is going to reinforce some of those abuser dynamics. Because sometimes what happens when that occurs is there's a feeling like what the pastor's saying is forgive and forget, rather than being attuned to the safety of the battered partner. So this leads us to some really interesting and tricky issues. The minister needs to be attuned to the safety of the battered person, number one, and then later can deal with the relational issues that unfold as a part. So the minister's first responsibility is for safety, and I would argue the minister doesn't have a responsibility to raise the issue of forgiveness with the person who's been battered. So I think, in fact, even though we pray the Lord's Prayer together, I think, in fact, it's incumbent upon the minister not to raise this issue because of how power's been used against battered partners for so long. I also think there's a confusion about the definitions of forgiveness and reconciliation, which are different things, and people conflate the two. So they think that forgiveness means returning to the battered partner, which is actually would actually be a process of reconciliation. So let me just quickly define each. Forgiveness involves understanding a personal harm and grappling with it. So forgiveness requires knowing the trauma that one has been through. Early on in a battered relationship, it's arguable whether someone could actually forgive if they're stuck in a cycle where they don't realize the harm that's being done to them. But forgiveness, I understand, is a one-to-one aspect of a person's relationship with God. And Christians believe in the presence of sin and that we all need redemption. On the vertical dimension, God has forgiven all humanity, and God's grace allows life to flourish. And sometimes I do believe, late in a process, God can equip someone to forgive a battered partner. But I think this is a mystery, and I think we can't kind of manage or negotiate this process. So the fact that forgiveness occurs sometimes is something we should take note of. Forgiveness is primarily for the person who's been abused, if it's an important part of their spiritual process. And what it does is it releases the claim that the abused partner holds against the abuser. Reconciliation is a different process. It implies the restoration of a relationship. A common mistake is to think of forgiveness as implying reconciliation, as if once you've forgiven, then you have to reconcile with the partner. But in order for reconciliation to occur in an abusive relationship, the abuser has to be in treatment for several years without any relapses, and the battered partner has to really achieve some independence, including financial and emotional independence from the abuser. And so reconciliation requires that unequal power relationships be balanced out towards shared power. So reconciliation can only occur in a situation where both persons have a shared power. And sometimes this is the result of an authentic and lengthy process in which safety is established and unequal power relationships are redistributed. I think there could be reconciliation without forgiveness. Someone could achieve equality in their relationship again. Forgiveness, I think, is a separate part of a process that is something in which a person releases the claim of harm that's been done, and it's only the result of a prolonged process. And it's not something that can be encouraged by a pastor. It's a mystery of a spiritual life that you can't even really plan for, but it's a unilateral process. So the pastoral, again, let me just redefine what I said about reconciliation and forgiveness. Beginning with forgiveness. Forgiveness requires an awareness of trauma's impact. Forgiveness is not self-sacrificing. It's chosen without coercion by a religious group or religious leader, and it's for the battered person rather than the batterer. It's unilateral for the sake of the battered, and then it does not imply the restoration of relationship. And then reconciliation. Reconciliation is a peer-to-peer relationship with equal decision-making power, and it means the batterer is aware of their own tendency towards violence and monitoring this, and they're not using children as a pawn, and there's a sense of equal dignity and sense of respect and an absolute lack of coercion. So, as I've said, the misplaced emphasis on forgiveness in Christian counsel means that people are still struggling with this notion of battering. It means they're not really aware of its impact, or they want to rush over it in a form of theological anxiety to rush to a conclusion. But I think it's more important that we focus on the person who's experienced battering and helping them tell their story in ways that create empowerment and decision-making power. So many women who leave abusive relationships go on to advocate for themselves or others as a part of leaving. Pam, for example, in the story I shared at the start, goes back to college at night and finishes an associate degree, and Pastor Janelle gives her a plaque at the graduation with her favorite verse about God being like a mother bear on it. And this image is one of strength and fortitude for Pam, who gets tears in her eyes as she reads it. So what I think of when I think of caring for people in domestic violence situations is keeping faith with the memory of suffering that they've been through in order to help keep them in mind. So this means the journey of leaving an intimate partner relationship where violence has occurred is a spiritual and theological one, where a person realizes that they're a person of dignity and that God keeps them in mind. And this, in turn, allows for the cry of prophetic justice to be named, and it allows people to attach to God and to others. So I'd like for you to be thinking as we conclude this part of the lecture today about whether you have some resources on hand to respond to domestic violence in your community. And so part of what I'm going to ask you to do in responding to this lecture is draw together about 4 or 5 resources for responding to domestic violence and then post them in the SurveyMonkey so that you have a chance to pull some things together in your area that could be helpful if you come in contact with this situation. So we started the lecture by talking about 14 on average domestic violence cases a year will be seen by a minister in the congregation, but how this is one of the areas that ministers notoriously do a poor job responding to. I'd like for you to be just reflecting now as we come to an end of this discussion as to why that's the case. Why do you think ministers do a poor job in this area? And I think this also touches on our notions of marriage. So many people need to be reminded that violence in a relationship destroys the covenant or sacrament nature of that relationship, depending on how you think of marriage. So ministers should never encourage battered spouses to stay in the relationship to save a marriage. Given what you've learned in this discussion about intimate partner violence, and within its broader context of Cooper White's work on violence against women and the church's response, what are the implications of this notion for our pastoral understandings of marriage and family, especially in this class? Given how widespread abuse is in relationships, does that change our notion of marriage or what it should be? Or do we somehow continue to hold on to the same Christian and theological notions of marriage, but reframe them or reinterpret them somehow in light of the prevalence of this problem? You might also notice that many battered spouses stay in a partnership in order to change the abuser. How do you convey to someone who's in a battered relationship that it's God's job to change the abuser, and how does this theological reframing occur so that battered partners can find hope for themselves and for their families? And finally, what's wrong with asking battered spouses to forgive their partners, in your opinion? So I think intimate partner violence is one of the challenging issues facing us, and it's one of the issues where I really feel like family systems and other approaches don't do an adequate job because they don't address power differentials well enough. So I think you can kind of see this by the social location of many family systems theorists. So you might think back about there was some discussion of gender in McGoldrick's genogram book, but you might think back across the class and think, how would a thoroughgoing attention to the prevalence of domestic violence in intimate partner relationships change what we've talked about in this class? How would knowing about the problem and its significance really reshape what we do in pastoral care? And so I just want to mention a couple of additional resources. One is a book by Al Miles for the African American Church. It's called Domestic Violence, What Every Pastor Needs to Know. And he addresses the silence and stigma that are associated with this issue in the African American Church and how frequently ministers participate in kind of asking battered partners to go back into a battering situation. Another one that I would also emphasize is that The Verbally Abusive Relationship by Patricia Evans, How to Recognize It and How to Respond to It. So as I've talked about this issue You might also be thinking about the issue of verbal abuse, which can be just as devastating as physical abuse, and in its impact on family and relationships. So in the story that I shared, Pam doesn't ultimately leave her abuser, and so you might just think about, how do you have pastoral hope in situations that are chronic and seem intractable? So how do you kind of continue to hope when you yourself might be threatened to despair? And how do you provide people the resources that help them get the change that they need while continuing to let go of their choices in your pastoral practice? I think one of the things I've learned from discussing this and writing about it is that leaving, and from some of my own volunteering in shelter work, is that leaving a domestic violence situation is a profound spiritual act. I think those classic trauma responses of fight, flight, or freeze are all signs of the image of God within us, crying out that we not be harmed. And so the pastoral response to intimate partner violence that takes it seriously, that advocates and that gives resources, is essentially allowing God to work in a person's life and allowing God's true self to become present apart from the abusive or oppressive dynamics of relationships. And I think all of us live on a continuum of relationships that are somewhat equal, somewhat unequal, and have aspects of shared power in them. So let's just explore, as we talk about intimate partner violence today, what are some ways that we can make relationships safer, have more shared power, and where we can help people to make decisions that matter to them. Because each person has dignity regardless and apart from their relationship, that we need to affirm and that we need to emphasize in the first place, so that we can help God be a protecting God, an ever-present help in times of trouble. Okay, be well today. Thank you for watching this.